Hello and welcome to episode 7 of Polarizing Conversations. Today we have the pleasure of being joined by Katie Davey, who joined the Pond-Deshpande Centre as its executive director in this past November 2022. So I have the pleasure of working with Katie at the Pond-Deshpande Centre, and she's a public policy entrepreneur working at the intersection of our biggest social and economic challenges, one of which we'll chat about today. She uses creative and innovative solutions to improve or solve existing policy, program, and system challenges, specifically those challenges that create inequalities and impact the most vulnerable people in our world. Her goal is to redesign our systems to create a more inclusive future for all. In her most recent role, Katie served as the Director of Policy and PPF Media at the Public Policy Forum, a leading independent Canadian think tank. In this role, she built PPF Media and the Atlantic Initiative from the ground up. Recently, Katie has co-authored reports on redefining the childcare workforce in Canada and creating a more sustainable future for journalism in Canada as well. She holds a degree in political science from the University of New Brunswick and a master's of applied politics from Wilfrid Laurier University, and she also served as a policy advisor to the Brian Gallant government on abortion policy, which leads us to our question today. And thanks so much for being here, Katie. So I'd love to pass it over to you with the question of what makes abortion such a polarizing topic?
Yeah, thanks so much, Vanessa. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Look, this is a challenging topic, and frankly, as you and I have discussed before, it's also challenging to find people to actually have this conversation in good faith because it is so polarizing for a number of issues or number of reasons. Rather, I think what we're seeing right now is actually an increase in polarization around the topic of abortion, particularly because of what we're seeing in the United States, which is a systematic state after state level reframe of abortion laws. And what we're seeing, just most recently in Florida, laws that would prohibit women from accessing abortion after 6 weeks, which we know for many women, they don't even know they're pregnant at 6 weeks. And, you're seeing that in state after state after state after state, and an overturning of foundational abortion decisions at the Supreme Court level in the United States. It is not a surprise for this issue, like many, that in Canada, we in some ways see ourselves in what happens in the United States because we're so close, well, in proximity physically, and because we do see a creeping of US kind of politics into Canada over and over and over and over again. That said, Canada has a very different reality around abortion access and abortion protection, I'll say. And so, I think as we enter into this conversation right now, it is the case that the conversation around abortion is growing in North America, I guess I would say. But here in Canada, we need to ensure that we're entering into the conversation with accurate information and not allowing kind of disinformation, misinformation to spread into our own framing around what is the reality around abortion access and what can and should be done into the future.
I have so many questions about all of that and what you just mentioned. If you're to look maybe under the iceberg of those trends that you mentioned in the US and potentially in Canada, what do you think, in your view, is below the surface of these trends?
Well, misogyny, patriarchy. No, but I say that, in a very serious way. Throughout all of history, women's bodies have been policed and controlled, and we're seeing that happen again. It hasn't gone away, but it's resurfacing. And I think you're also seeing this play out in a conversation around LGBTQ and trans rights as well. I think I think it is traditionally has been a very a wedge issue in politics, which is a reality, and we can come back to that. But it goes straight to the issue of women's bodily autonomy, and that has been something within the broad scope of women's equality and women's rights that has been challenged for forever in Canada and around the world, really.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, when I read your bio, one of the things that it mentioned that you're working on is around childcare. And I know at the Pond-Deshpande Centre, one of the projects that you're helping lead is the Early Childhood Education Lab throughout Atlantic Canada. And I think in a lot of the discourse, often the simplified discourse, we hear people say, oh, well, if you are, encouraging access to abortion, then you probably don't care about childcare, early childhood education, that these things have to exist um, separately from one another. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, for you, where all of those things kind of stand together.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, here in Canada, it is a charter protection for women and for folks that can get pregnant. Which if we're talking about LGBTQ rights as well, we need to also acknowledge that it's not just women that can get pregnant, but it is a fundamental right in Canada that women and all people have the right to safety and security of person. That is the actual, section, I think it's section 7 of the charter. So that should end the conversation, right? That point blank, we have a charter right to security of our own bodily autonomy as women. However, that is not where the conversation typically ends. But I think that is for many and most advocates, especially, that is women having access and autonomy over their body and what happens to it is where the conversation can and should end, point blank. And for me, that is also where the conversation ends. That said, we can and should be also walking and chewing gum at the same time, right? You talk about childcare. Well, it is obviously the case that we need to be supporting women in any decision that they make, but it is their decision, right? And so the decision around, or the kind of linkage in some ways, I guess, to childcare or to, maternal health, I think they're just kind of false equivalents because they're very fundamentally different conversations. You can support wholeheartedly women's right to make decisions about their body and also build a world-class system that supports the health and well-being of women, that supports the health and well-being of children and education, and frankly incentivizes in other ways and supports families to have children, right? Those do not have to be, they can be connected, but there is no fundamental connection between the two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and it's such a complex issue, and I think for me that's part of what makes it polarizing, and sometimes I know that we both work in systems change, and I often think about a system as, typically we see the image of an iceberg where it's like the tiny part that's above the water and then the big part that we can't see that's maybe harder to understand. And one of the things that I often think about is, as you know, I'm trained as a teacher, and I'm also trained in biology, and so I think sometimes we don't do justice to kids as help them learn about their bodies and sex and really like equity in sex and what that all means. And to me, that seems like such a precursor to the abortion debate, which is, I think um, no one wants to be in a position where they are going to have an abortion. And I think that that's important. And then the access to it, should it need to happen, and when all of this stuff was happening, in the US fairly recently, there was a lot of, or I saw a lot of conversation about the different situations where someone might want or need an abortion, and there's just such a complexity there. So, I think I just mentioned a bit about, the education component and then leading into the healthcare component, but I'd love to hear any thoughts that you might have about that like very early stage of, as it relates to the cycle of what we talked about from early child care early childhood education going into, the school system and all of these types of things. Like how do we help people, both men and women, understand how their bodies work, and then what that might mean for them, and these potential decisions that they might have to make.
Yeah, completely. I think it's a very important element to this discussion because fundamentally education empowers everybody, and I think the discussion around comprehensive sex education is one that doesn't get discussed very often. I mean, you did see in I guess Ontario under Kathleen Wynne, there was a massive overhaul of the sex education curriculum from really K to 12, right? And what that looks like in K is discussing consent, right? As basic as sharing and hugging and all of those things. It's very, very, very age appropriate, I guess is what I'll say. Yet that became again another very polarizing issue and a polarizing discussion, and it was a key election issue. And then the current government, when they came into power, did roll back some of those elements of progress under this kind of guise of, parental rights or parental authority. But the reality is our, public education system exists to level the playing field in all ways, right? And so comprehensive sex education is one of those ways. And again, I think, as you say, it's important for everybody, and that is a big first step. I think also the other thing that we're seeing in Canada just recently, which is really exciting, is more universal access to contraception. In British Columbia, in British Columbia, in their most recent budget, just about a month ago, they announced universal contraception for anyone who doesn't have access, which I think is a fantastic step and something that can and should continue to roll out in Canada in every province. I think that would be really fundamental. And then I think, you mentioned healthcare as well. The reality is abortion access is healthcare, right? It is fundamentally healthcare, and we should treat it as such, and we should treat it in a way that, as you say, is again a deeply personal decision to the person making that decision, and it is their decision, and they should be able to access the healthcare that they need in the form of abortion access that is high quality, accessible, and responsive to their needs. I do think, in that broad context as well, what frustrates me is it often feels like we focus on abortion as, the only point of reproductive health care, and at the expense of all other kind of discussions around reproductive health care, which does a disservice again especially to women, but to all folks that are, seeking reproductive care. And I think that is a conversation that we can and should expand on in this country, because it's not just, abortion that's in bad shape in some places. It's really all access to reproductive health care.
Yeah, well, then I'm wondering, like, because you also have, background and interest in media and then in policy, I'm wondering when you were working as a policy advisor in New Brunswick on abortion policy, like help us understand what some of those conversations sounded like how polarizing were they? What were the concerns on both sides? I mean, it sounds like you were commenting on, the right to access abortion is a healthcare issue. What were you hearing from the other side of the debate?
Yeah, so New Brunswick is unique in the broad kind of Canadian conversation around abortion access for a couple of reasons. So, I won't drone on too much on a kind of history lesson here, but, as I mentioned, abortion is enshrined as a right in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. As you know, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is not actually that old. It just, recently celebrated, I think its 35th birthday. Which means that is not that long ago, right? And so essentially,
yes, I am older than that.
Well, then you are, older than the right to abortion in Canada.
There you go.
But essentially what happened, again, folks, I'm not going to do a whole history lesson, but folks who are involved in this space would recognize surely the name, Dr. Henry Morgentaler, including, New Brunswickers. Dr. Morgentaler was a leading abortion provider and activist in Canada, particularly in Montreal, but across the country. And that was at a time when abortion was still quite criminalized. So it was under Pierre Trudeau that abortion access began to be slowly decriminalized. So what that means is it was in the Criminal Code of Canada. And under Pierre Trudeau, there were kind of some new rules that came in. So it was, you could access an abortion if the following criteria were met. And that was essentially that it was deemed necessary by a kind of therapeutic abortion committee, I think was the actual name. That kind of has been now traditionally called, or colloquially rather, called the 2-doctor rule. So you had to kind of sign off an approval from multiple doctors. Henry Morgentaler was taken to court and took to court various governments in this country, including the federal government. And because he was operating a clinic in New Brunswick, this is where it all kind of ties back to New Brunswick. Dr. Morgentaler was in the courts with the New Brunswick government for years and years and years, all the way until his passing, which was, if I remember correctly, around kind of the early 2010s. The reason he was in court with the New Brunswick government was because after the ruling at the Supreme Court level in the mid-'80s, the New Brunswick government refused to actually amend its rules around abortion. And so it was a charter challenge. Dr. Morgentaler was leading the charter challenge against the New Brunswick government. And successive Liberal and Conservative governments fought against this all the way up until 2014, basically, when Brian Gallant was elected, and when at the same time the Dr. Morgentaler passed, thus making the case moot. Okay, so then up until late 2014, 2015. To access abortion in New Brunswick, you needed, again, 2 doctors to sign off to have it performed, in a hospital setting, or the Morgentaler Clinic, right, which was providing private access for a kind of fee-for-service private access, which, after it was unable to continue to operate, that is when Clinic 554 kind of took over and came to be. So you can kind of think of, when I say Morgentaler Clinic, that's, in some ways synonymous with Clinic 554. So then that's when, there was the 2014 provincial election. This was also at a time, which I think is an important context, where, Justin Trudeau had just been elected leader of the federal Liberal Party, which shockingly, I guess, has now been about 10 years ago, almost to the day. It seems, time goes by very quickly. This was, when Trudeau had kind of came to power of the federal party, he had said, as you may recall, that, to run for him, every member would need to be pro-choice and support a woman's right to choose. This is at the same time that around Brian Gallant coming to power in New Brunswick, and he then kind of adopts a very similar approach. Of course, there is the advocacy community that has been pushing for improved access in New Brunswick for, again, decades, and that is, of course, also influencing this. But he then, runs on a platform to improve access to abortion. When we talk about polarization, during that campaign, you had, and Vanessa, being in the Moncton region, you may remember this, you had anti-choice advocates that actually sent postcards into competitive liberal ridings that showed, pictures, the horrific pictures that you see employed in these contexts of, basically fetuses, deformed fetuses and things like that, into ridings, again, across the province that were competitive in a way to, deter people from voting for the Liberal Party and the Liberal candidate in that riding because of their support for expanded access. To this day, like when I talk to some Liberal candidates that ran in that 2014 election, especially in some rural ridings, they say and they tell me that they think they lost because of the party's position on abortion. I don't think that's true. In many of those ridings, they were not competitive for the Liberal Party already. They were going to lose anyways. But to hear that context, right, 10 years later shows you how polarizing that 2014 election was around this topic. And then, as the Liberals were elected, and they did immediately strike down the 2-doctor rule. So that was removed. And they then began down the path. And I'm saying they in this context because I didn't join the team until about late 2015. So they then began down the path of what expanded access would look like. And that, I think, is where a lot of the kind of negotiation started, both internally inside the government, externally with stakeholders, and then within just the reality of what was possible. So that was kind of how the campaign unrolled, but then it got, into actually, as we say, kind of policy making and figuring out what was and wasn't possible. And that was, that is where tremendous challenges, I won't say started, because as I just outlined, they were already continuing, but that's where, these kind of debates really started hitting the road again.
Yeah, and when you mention those challenges, help us understand what they were.
Yeah, so the primary challenge, really, and the primary request, I'll say, was that, again, as the Morgentaler Clinic kind of transitioned, I'll say, into Clinic 554, they were continuing to provide, again, abortion access, but Medicare would not and still does not pay for that access in a clinic setting in New Brunswick. There is a regulation in the kind of Medical Service Payment Act in New Brunswick that essentially says abortions will not be funded. It's basically surgical procedures will not be funded outside of hospital settings, and it particularly and explicitly names abortions. So the advocacy community was really pushing to remove that regulation so that Medicare could provide the funding for the abortions happening in the clinic setting. What the government at the time decided to do was instead expand access and provide kind of abortion clinics into hospitals. And this was based, frankly, purely on space. So they were able to find the space to do that in both the 2 hospitals in Moncton, so the hospital within the Anglophone system and within the Francophone system, and then the hospital in Bathurst. So that happened. Again, continued push for one, to kind of remove the regulation 8420 to provide the payment within clinic settings, and a push towards, just broad expanded access was continuing. We went to the went back to the drawing board over and over and over again, explored tons and tons of different opportunities to expand access regionally, and to in some ways to no avail. And the reason really that we were even looking for those options was because the advice given, and which I understand to still be given today, as you can see the current premier has said this publicly, is that if you were to remove that regulation 8420, it's kind of a slippery slope into private clinics opening to provide hip replacements, knee replacements, cataract surgery, all of these kind of these services. Which, look, you had a public service that had fought against abortion access like institutionally fought against it for 50 years, to get them to kind of fully change their position and mind on this was and is continues to be quite challenging. So that was the advice being given by the professional public service. So you have to kind of understand within a new government, hearing that they were looking at alternative options. And so we continued to look at space in different hospitals, which again in the Deck in Fredericton had no space, the St. John Regional had no space. There was maybe space in the Ormocto Hospital, but that doesn't have transit access. There was maybe space at Joseph's Hospital in St. John, but they were actually, I guess, when they became part of the provincial network, they signed like an agreement with the province, which I have never seen, and I don't know anyone has ever been able to find evidence of this, but this is what we were told, that they would never provide abortion because they were kind of a religious hospital or something as they kind of joined the network. So there was essentially no space in hospitals. And then this was also at the time when the kind of, again, colloquially called abortion pill was starting to kind of go through the processes in Canada to be approved by the federal regulatory board. It had already been approved for years in the US, and it was starting to go through approvals. And so what we decided to do when, again, we continued to hit wall after wall after wall around some of these access points, we decided to really lean into the abortion pill. The kind of the name of it, the like product name is Mifkai Miso. We decided to lean into that and actually approve it for provincial provincial funding on the formulary before any other province did. And actually, we did that before it was even fully kind of approved for bulk purchasing at the federal level. And that was probably, if I remember correctly, kind of maybe late 2016, early 2017. So we became the very first province to do that. And now every province in Canada offers free to its citizens access to the abortion pill. It was not a smooth rollout by any stretch. I won't pretend it was, but that was in some ways the way that we kind of pivoted when we couldn't find other solutions. And now actually in New Brunswick has the highest usage of the abortion pill of any other province in the country. And it's much higher than surgical access to abortion. So people have that additional choice, and they are, by and large, using that choice in New Brunswick. And kind of setting that stage for what would become a overwhelming policy across Canada. And based on this very long soliloquy in a way of all of this context, it was quite stark. New Brunswick went from being, a massive lagger on abortion access to then, being the first province to offer this service. So that, was frankly a 180 in just a few years.
I'd like to tie back some of the comments that you just talked about, that you just discussed, with how you opened and you talked about what's changing in the US, which I think potentially, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is a result of some popular conversations that are happening around, when does life begin? Regulations on women's bodies and their right to choose, and then how that relates to policy, which, as you discuss these things, I mean, I think it's clear to me at least that making these things happen is not easy. It takes time. There's lots of negotiations with different parties, lots of conversations, and then lots of asking, how do we interact with the current system? How do we create the outcomes that we're looking for? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, where we are now, how it relates to maybe the popular conversations that we're hearing in the media, and any thoughts that you might have on where we're going.
Yeah, I think, in the context of New Brunswick, I think in hindsight, for me personally, and, potentially for some other folks that would have worked with us, I think we would have or would want to, again, remove the regulation 8420. And, I'm hopeful that a future government will do that. That said, that doesn't really improve access because right now in New Brunswick, there is only, and, Clinic 554 has had to largely close. They are still performing. I think, 1 day a week abortions in the clinic setting, but it's not at all clear to me that we will just see pop-ups of clinic settings across the province if that regulation is removed, predominantly because with the massive shift to the abortion pill, it does change the kind of demand side of surgical abortions, frankly. And that is, again, abundantly clear by data. So if that regulation is removed, which I think it should be, it's not actually clear to me how much that will increase and improve access. I think at the same time, we are continuing to have this conversation nationally. It is the case that in the United States and in Canada, abortion is used as a kind of identity politics type issue among the kind of partisan politicking. And I think, again, that needs to change. That said, in Canada, progressives are often accused of using abortion as kind of a wedge issue, and trying to paint, conservative politicians in a certain way. And, folks suggest that is, again, polarizing or controversial, and they're dividing, quote, dividing Canadians. That said, we are literally seeing that happen at every, state by state by state by state in the United States. It is something that needs to be kind of protected and fought for. In Canada, there's actually no law around abortion. So it is neither, legally protected nor legally regulated. And so what that means is, again, like, the access is really around the Supreme Court decision, but there is nothing at any federal or provincial level that legislates one way or another on, some of these questions around until when you could get an abortion, etc. And that is the tool that's being used in, again, state legislatures across the United States. In Canada, the advocacy community by and large does not support actual legislation to enshrine the right, because the second you write it down like that, then you do start having these conversations. Okay, well, until when is abortion accessible, right? Is it 8 weeks? Is it 12 weeks? Is it 16 weeks? And you get into these conversations. Where can it happen? For what reasons? All of these things that in Canada, again, activists think, we don't need to have that conversation. We need to have the conversation that this is healthcare, and we actually don't enshrine any other form of healthcare in legislation. So why would we enshrine kind of abortion access? So that is a very distinct difference in Canada, but it does mean there is a bit more precarity around access. I think, we need to continue to make it as accessible as possible. So I think particularly rural communities are at a disadvantage right now across Canada around access because, as we discussed, this is a deeply personal and sensitive issue. And so when you have, a rural community that might have one pharmacy, well, if you're looking for the abortion pill and, your sister-in-law works at the pharmacy, well, you're not going to go and get this filled in the pharmacy, right? Or you, again, are going to have to drive many hours. And this is the case, still across the country, drop times and things like that. So we need to be doing more to expand access and to expand access in different and innovative ways. I've started hearing people talk about maybe having, delivery points that are different from a pharmacist. Like maybe you get your prescription by a doctor and then maybe it's dropped off at the public library, for example, or, delivered directly to you via Canada Post. So I think these are conversations that can and should continue to happen around access points. But I just think we need to we need to, as we move forward on this conversation, pause and reflect on one, what it is that we need to protect, while also then having, stop, kind of remove the politicization of this issue and begin to have that broader conversation around overall reproductive health care in this country. Because, gynecological surgeries, for example, continue to have the highest wait times, the highest surgical wait times of any surgeries. In New Brunswick, for example, it is the longest wait time is gynecological surgeries. Yet, we hear lots about hip and knee replacements, but we're not hearing much at all about, that kind of improved access. So I think these are the types of things and how I would love to see the conversation evolve.
Yeah, thank you for that. So as you think about, we've talked a lot about the conversation around abortion and how that's driven policy and how that moves forward. And when I lived in Fredericton and I would drive by the Morgentaler Clinic 554, I think every single time I drove by that they were open, there was someone picketing, or I guess you could call it picketing in front of the clinic. And so I'm wondering, as we move to close this conversation, what thoughts you have on how we can, I guess, as a broader society, work to reconcile this very polarizing conversation and perhaps move it to your last point around, women's overall health and gynecological services. How do we move it to a more holistic conversation?
Yeah, well, I think, this is where it is incumbent upon political leadership to, stand firm and not allow, kind of an inch in one way or another on this, right? I think if we have that broad articulated support, and if we are kind of continuing to move towards improved access and understanding what that is, right? Actually understanding what that is. Because to your point, you're not going to get picketing necessarily if you get an abortion pill sent directly to your mailbox. You're also not going to get it, or to a much lesser extent, if you're accessing in a hospital setting, right? And so, like, looking at what it is we're actually trying to solve and then how we might solve it, I think is really what we kind of need to see and do. And I do just think if we kind of ask more of our political leaders to, to support this wholeheartedly and then take it off the table in a way, right? To stop using it as a kind of political wedge issue and to just kind of universally protect this right and this access to healthcare, and do it in, again, a way that is meaningful and is driven by, again, access and kind of what the community is asking for. Am I like totally optimistic that we're going to get there? No, I think honestly, as a couple of things start to happen in our global context, I think this conversation is going to become more challenging rather than less challenging. I don't see it going away at all in the United States. There's this one person, she's a kind of author and activist that I follow. Her name is Jessica Valentina, I think.
Oh, yes, I follow her as well.
Yeah, she's kind of doing this thing in the US right now where every single day she's writing an article about an individual person's story with access, or lack of access in the United States. And I think that type of activism is really important and needs to continue to be important. But, the global context here is that we have a declining birth rate, we have an aging population, and we have, like in many contexts, a rise in populism and a rise in a bit more kind of authoritarianism. And so I think as all of that is happening, it will not be shocking to me if we see more policing of women's bodies and if we see more or lack of nuance rather around some of these bigger conversations, when really what we should be doing is, again, supporting that choice, and then through that, again, yeah, for sure, incentivizing folks to in some ways lower the costs of having children and what that looks like, right? Through universal affordable childcare through, things like, HST rebates, and the Canada Child Benefit is another example. Like those types of policies can support, those who are making the decision to have children and to have more and more children, right? Which great, let's do that. But I think the conversation around abortion, actually, I don't see it getting less polarizing. I see it getting more polarizing, which is not a hopeful note to end on.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask, like, how likely do you see all of that? So really, you answered that. Um, yeah, and I think your comments there really point to how complex this all is and how it's embedded in so many other things. We've talked about healthcare, we've talked about, you just mentioned, how do we support people to have more kids, and what does that look like, and how do we do that in a realistic way? And there's so many elements of that. So perhaps as a final question, like, how do you see us bringing more nuance into this super complex and polarizing and very difficult topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is the policy on this is actually not complicated. It's quite simple. It's everything else around it that's really complex
Mm-hmm.
and polarizing. And I think we need to continue to continue to dialogue, but I have a hard time saying that and recognize and recommending it, because my fundamental philosophy is that I'm not going to defend somebody's fundamental right to their humanity, and so that is fundamentally what abortion is. It is fundamentally a decision about about personal autonomy, and that is non negotiable to me. But I think, we need to continue to, in some ways, engage in good faith where we can, and recognize that this conversation is unfortunately not going away, and build community and build reciprocity, and kind of collaboration where we can, to create, again, that community of care, and hopefully action as well, where it's needed.
Yeah, I like what you said about, it's difficult to have that conversation. Um, and I could imagine someone on the other side might say the same thing. I know I said last question, but maybe one more, which is, what thoughts do you have on being able to find common ground?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we move beyond this kind of lightning rod of the topic, we can hopefully find common ground on the recognition of access to fundamental health care, and access to just a broader, improved healthcare ecosystem overall. I think if we're able to have that dialogue, and we're able to talk about what that looks like across the spectrum for everybody, I think the stronger our healthcare system, the easier it is to be able to actually improve it and define what it is that is needed for everybody who, again, in Canada, is accessing a universal healthcare system. So I think if we're able to find common ground on that call for improvement broadly in the healthcare system and ecosystem, then maybe we're able to also identify, from that evidence and data, where it is that we continue to fall down on, and where we might be able to kind of broadly work together to improve.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, and that's been the goal of these conversations. I've been really curious about, you mentioned, like, the rise of populism and the rise, which is just, like, how do we stop seeing things in one extreme or the other, but how do we find common ground, which I think, sounds easy, but really it's not, at a community level, at individual level, in a relationship, all of these things, it can be very challenging. So I appreciate your insights today on both, the history of it, um, helping us understand like the deeper policy level and what that means both, provincially, nationally, in a more of a global context, and then your thoughts on finding common ground. Thank you so much for joining us today, Katie. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And I think with, so many of these elements around polarizing conversations, we can fight that polarization with broadening, shared set of common facts. And so this is, my final plug for, an increase in the strength of journalism and local journalism in Canada and abroad. I think that is, one way that we both secure democracy and fight, mis and disinformation and build that shared set of common ground.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me for today's polarizing conversation. Much gratitude to Inspiring Communities for supporting season 1 of this podcast series. If you like this episode, please share it and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you missed the other episodes, check us out at www.polarizingconversations.com. We have some exciting polarizing conversations coming up in the rest of season 1. I sincerely hope you'll join me on this journey of finding common ground on some of the most difficult topics of our time. See you next time.